All right, we're going to spend some time reflecting on this text together. Thank you, Heather, for reading it. It is the time of year when leaves are changing, obviously, beginning to fall. We see on our city streets in Gatineau Park, the colors change, the reds, the oranges, the yellows, they are all glorious. For lots of people, it's their favorite time of year. It's hoodie and hot coffee season, cold nights, warm days. But we also know, because we live in Canada, that this phase is somewhat temporary. The leaves will soon be gone. The cool wind will be replaced with a cold wind. The rustle of colorful dying leaves will be replaced by the whistling of wind through bare branches. And this morning, what I want us to do is to think about the autumn season as a metaphor for life, as Paul describes it in Romans 8. Because the autumn season really expresses, or it kind of embodies, three things. It first embodies the beauty of life, like the glory of the present moment, all the lovely colors. It also hints at the suffering of life. All things die, all things fade. There's tragedy and struggle alongside the beauty. And thirdly, because we've been through all of this before, at least most of it, except for the very young babies, the fading of fall does give us hope for the future. Winter is coming. Everything will die and get cold, but so is the spring. There is a future beyond this present season. The leaves will return bright and green. We can't yet feel that. We can't yet sense that, but we believe it to be on the way. So there are really three parts of autumn. There's beauty, brokenness, and hope. And Paul tackles these three things in a different order in Romans 8. He first talks about our present suffering, why things are the way that they are, why our world is the way that it is. Then he talks about the beauty of this present experience, how God ministers to us in the middle of that suffering. And finally, Paul talks about hope, how the work of God and really the unstoppable love of God gives us hope to move forward. So that's kind of how we'll follow his thread through the passage: present suffering, present experience, and present hope. If you look at verse 18, Paul begins by telling us he has concluded something important. He's considered all the facts, and he says, now I know that our present sufferings are not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed to us. I wonder if you could picture, just for a moment, one of those old systems of weights and measures, where there's like a balance in the middle and plates on either side that are suspended. Paul says if you stack up over on one side, on the plates on one half, if you stack up all the sufferings of the present moment, all the hardships, all the difficulties that this world has to offer, and that's quite a bit, he says the future glory far outweighs it. In fact, he basically says the future glory is going to break the scale. The glory to be revealed outweighs it. He said the future glory over here is like an elephant on one plate, and there's just like a little acorn on the other side. That it's not worth comparing. The glory obliterates the suffering in terms of its weightiness. Still, the present suffering is not fake. It's still suffering. If you go down a little bit further and look at verse 20, Paul begins to explain why things are the way that they are. Why is there suffering? He answers because the reason is the created order, which is all that there is, has been subjected to futility. What does it mean for something to be futile? It just means that a thing cannot fulfill its intended purpose. If you have a can opener and you remove the blade from it, you have rendered the can opener futile. It cannot can open in the way it was meant to. It's been thwarted in its purpose. So if Paul is saying, if creation has been subjected to futility, it means creation cannot be what it was intended to be. Which then, of course, begs the question, well, what was it intended to be? Well, it was not intended to have thorns and thistles. Creation was supposed to be this well-ordered, fruit-bearing animals, plants, and people all living together in perfect harmony, us in harmony in relationship with God. As Ecclesiastes says, everything being made beautiful in its time. I mean, just imagine if we had a world where things tended toward order, not disorder. Kids, imagine what if your room got cleaner over time, not messier. Gardeners, imagine what if weeds did not have to be plucked. Parents, what if cars got cleaner over time, not messier? It's difficult to imagine. And we actually have entire laws of thermodynamics to try to describe, well, what's gone wrong? Newton, in his third law, he says what Paul is saying here, that created order, created systems always tend towards disorder. Entropy always increases. Maybe you're having high school flashbacks. Things fall apart. Creation was subjected to futility. It's why it bothers us so much, because it wasn't meant to be like this. Yet at the same time, we discover in verse 20, it was God who did this. So creation wasn't created to be futile. It didn't choose futility. It didn't start that way. God subjected creation to it. And of course, the question is, well, why? Why would God do that? That doesn't seem like a very good idea. Paul answers, in hope that creation will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain freedom and glory. Somehow, Paul says, creation will be bettered and improved and made more glorious. But of course, we're not there yet. Right now, if you continue reading in verse 22, right now, creation groans as if in the pains of childbirth. The creation is not glorious yet, rather it groans. Now, I've had the privilege of being present at 4 births, all the births of my children. If you've been around a woman giving birth, you will know groaning is a very polite way to describe that process. Indeed, even pain does not even begin to make sense of labor. It's not a pain in the way that other kinds of pain are pain. But I do think the metaphor is still helpful because this childbirth metaphor for creation, it insists on 2 things. First, that there is present pain. The Bible is remarkably unsentimental on this point. It doesn't insist that we pretend the pain away. It doesn't dismiss the lived experience of any of us. The Bible doesn't turn away from disaster or famine or sickness or war. The Bible understands totalitarian regimes, family turmoil. Paul tells us the created order, it groans with pain. As the theologian Wesley from The Princess Bride once said, life is pain. Anyone who tells you different is selling something. And that's really the first truth that this metaphor makes sense of, is that there is pain. Any woman who's given birth will tell you, pain is involved. But the second truth is that the new creation is in the womb ready to be delivered. This world is not all there is. But indeed, all the scriptures drip with this promise of a new heavens and new earth. And it isn't just creation that groans. Paul says in verse 23, we who are Christians, that's those who have the first fruits, the first taste of the Spirit, we groan as well as we wait for our adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. Now, maybe you're wondering, is Paul being sexist here? What about daughters? They don't get mentioned. Well, you ought to know that in Greco-Roman culture, daughters didn't normally inherit anything. And so what Paul is saying is he's saying, actually, no, the status of women is higher than you think because all of God's people, men or women, they will all receive a full inheritance. They will all be treated like sons, which is a good thing when it comes to inheritances. So in our life right now, Paul says, we all groan waiting for our full adoption into God's family and for our bodies to be made new. Which means we don't have our full spiritual inheritance yet. Which means our physical bodies are falling apart. Creation groans and we groan along with it. This is the suffering of our present time. I've thought about this quite a bit, and I'm now pretty convinced that mosquitoes will not be present in the new heavens and new earth. I don't know how the food chain will work. The bats need to eat, the fish need to eat. I understand that. I do have great hope, though, that mosquitoes won't be around to bother us anymore. And it's been helpful to reflect, even in a silly way, that as annoying as mosquitoes are, as ruining as they are to some outdoor experiences, as much as I hope for them to be banished when all things are renewed, that same angst can be applied to myself. Because is anyone else getting tired of sins that plague them? Or you long to be different, or you just long to actually be patient or kind or self-controlled. Or when we talk about redemption of our bodies, anyone want a different body? Not necessarily to look different, but imagine being without aches and pains, or free of cancer, or free of an autoimmune disease, or free of whatever. We groan inwardly, Paul says, as we wait for our adoptions as sons and the redemption of our bodies. This present suffering is difficult. It hurts like childbirth. And actually, I think we actually do a great service to one another, to each other as Christians, when we just simply acknowledge there is difficulty in this present age. I think there are great temptations in our time to ignore it, or to medicate it, or try to vacation it away, or eat it away, or scroll it away. I think it actually just takes a lot of courage to stare into the void, to say with a loud voice, this world is futile, and to groan at its futility. To call the pangs of childbirth for what they are, it hurts, and you'd like it to stop. Thank you very much. Paul says we, the world, the mosquitoes, like none of us are okay. We aren't who we ought to be. We've been subjected to futility, our can opener. We've been robbed of our blade. We cannot do what we want. So then that leads us to part 2. Our present experience. What do we make of this? Look at verse 26. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. So if we have a God who has subjected the created order and indeed humanity to futility, is he just sort of standing back, arms crossed, watching us suffer? Is he saying, oh, I hope you don't mind those mosquitoes? What about the ravages of Alzheimer's? Like, where is God in this futile world? Paul tells us there are 3 consolations, 3 things God offers to us in our present time. The first consolation is this, that God the Spirit helps us in our weakness. Now, how does he do that? In what way does he help? He helps us know what to pray. Still in verse 26, Paul's like, you don't actually know what to pray for? you don't know. There, in any situation, there is something that's the will of God, something you could ask for or be thankful for, something you could do. We don't always know what it is. You've probably had that experience of not knowing what to pray. Maybe you've applied for a job at a new company. There are some clear benefits, which is why you applied for it in the first place. Better salary, better working conditions, more interesting work. But there are drawbacks, longer hours, longer commute, or whatever. What should you pray? Should you pray that God will give you the job? Or if we just don't know, maybe all of our prayers should just simply be, thy will be done. It's not necessarily wrong, but I'm sure we'd like to pray with some more specificity. In all these moments when we don't know how to pray, the Spirit of God intercedes with what Paul calls groanings too deep for words. Now, I love this. One commentator writing about that phrase said, and I quote, "No one is certain what this means," which I love because the literal Greek is wordless groans. The Spirit is uttering wordless groans. Like, I don't even know what that means. But somehow in the relationship of the Trinitarian God, the Spirit is both helping us pray and speaking to the Father on our behalf. And at the end of verse 27, Paul repeats this similar idea. The Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. So look, in all of the perplexity and suffering of this present time, in all of our half-hearted prayers or wrong-hearted prayers or insufficient prayers, the Spirit of God prays with you and helps you to pray according to God's will. We are not alone in this futile world. Paul says we are weak, but he is strong, as the children's song goes. We are being helped in our weakness. Second consolation is the providence of God. If you look at verse 28, Paul says that for those who love God, all things work together for good. Now, this is one of the most quoted, best known verses in all of Romans. It's also one of the most misunderstood verses. Because Paul is saying that God can take all the things that happen in this futile world and make them work together for good. You probably know, or you may have heard of the story of Joseph. If not, maybe you've just seen the movie. But he's kidnapped and enslaved by his brothers. He's exiled to Egypt, jailed wrongly in Egypt. He comes to power. He ends up leading a campaign, saves thousands, maybe even tens, hundreds of thousands of people from starvation. And his brothers come to meet him. And he has all the power over them. He holds their life in their hands. And he says something very important to his brothers. After all the evil they've done him, he says, you, my brothers, you intended it for evil, but God intended it for good. And I think Paul is echoing Joseph's sentiment quite closely. If you look carefully at verse 28, you'll notice we can still call things evil or bad. God can use all things, all of them. God can use suffering. He can use disease. He can use family dysfunction. He can use enslavement and famines. God can use evil people doing evil things, and that doesn't make them good. And there is this idea, sometimes pops up in churches, where we have to take every hardship and every tragedy and every evil, and we have to paint them with this broad brush that says, well, there must be a silver lining. Or we must make lemonade out of these lemons. I don't think that's what verse 28 means. Paul is saying there is real evil in the world. There is real futility. The thorns and thistles, they are growing up. Call it for what it is. And yet, God can still bring about good. Thomas Watson, an English Puritan, memorably summarized this. He says, God can draw straight lines with crooked sticks. Which means God can take all the things that happen in this world and still make it beautiful. We don't always see it. We don't always understand it, but we trust, Paul says, that God is at work. Third consolation, the golden chain of salvation. Now, I didn't make up that title. I couldn't find out who did. The internet wouldn't tell me. But theologians have been calling verse 29 and 30 the golden chain, or just the chain of salvation, for quite a long time. But Paul, in these verses, he links together some very important theological ideas, basically telling us if you have one, if you have the first, they all are connected to each other. It's like a chain. And he says first in verse 29 that God foreknew some people. Now we know this must refer, or it cannot refer, to all people, because we see later the ones God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of Jesus. And clearly, that's not everyone. That's not all the humans. So then the ones God foreknew, it really has to mean something like foreloved, that God knew these people in such a way that he set his love on them. And because God knows every person, but God knew some people in this particularly loving way. What happened next, Paul says God predestined them, which just means he gave them a destination. What is that destination? Paul says to look like Jesus. He predestined them. He gave them a destination of being conformed to the image of the Son. And that just means, conformed obviously just means to be shaped into. And the Bible often uses this imagery of a potter, who has a lump of clay. And they are trying to predestine it to be a tall, slender vase. And to that end, if you've watched a pot, they shape it and they cut it and they smooth it and they have it like on the wheel and whatever potters do to take a lump of clay and to shape it to its desired end. And Paul is saying if you're a Christian, God has a destination for you, and that destination is to look like Jesus. And God is polishing and shaping and molding and using all the circumstances of life to that end. Paul goes on to say, those whom God predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified, which is to make right. Those he justified, he also glorified. Now, there's a lot to be said here, and in future weeks we are going to get into this whole predestination thing, why God does it, what it means. Romans 9 and 10 deal quite extensively with it. If you have a lot of questions, you're just going to have to sit on them. I'm going to suck you back in for future weeks. You got to come back. We'll talk about it. But for now, what I want you to think about, because really the context of this chapter is, what does the golden chain of salvation mean to those who suffer? Because that's what Paul's writing into here. And for those who are suffering, for those living in the futile world, the chain of salvation reminds them that everything that is happening is shaping them into the image of Jesus. It's all part of the potter's great work. They're reassured that whatever is happening, it doesn't end like this, but it ends in glory. A glory, remember Paul has said, it far outweighs anything suffered in this life. It's not worth comparing. This is a profound consolation to those who groan under the futility of life. So the three consolations, the Spirit helping in our weakness, the providence of God working all things together for good, and this chain of salvation. That leads us to part 3, our present hope. In the remaining verses at the end, Paul goes on a positive rant, a good rant, where he's just asking and answering his own questions about what this means. He's summing up these truths. For those who believe that what happens in a person's life, he even starts with this question very helpfully. What shall we say to these things? Maybe you're wondering that. How am I supposed to respond? Okay, so the world groans in futility, and we groan, and the Spirit helps us in our weakness, and God's doing stuff, foreknowing, predestining, calling. What happens in our hearts? Well, Paul asks and answers 5 questions that tell us what we should expect. Verse 31, first Paul asks hypothetically, if God is for us, who can be against us? What does he mean by that? It's another version of that measuring scale from earlier. Paul is arguing, if God's over here on this side of the scale, then it doesn't really matter who's on the other. It doesn't matter if you stack up the whole world and all the people and all your family and all your friends. If they're all stacked up on this side, none of that matters. You don't have to be afraid because God is for you. And in the final verses of this chapter, Paul is going to list a lot of things that make us fear. Distress and persecution and famine and nakedness and swords. None of those things can stop the chain of salvation. God is for you. It doesn't matter who's on the other side. You don't have to be afraid. Question 2, in verse 32, he asks, he who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? This question addresses our worries, our anxieties about our life, what we're going to eat, what we're going to drink, what we're going to wear, where we're going to live. Paul argues, as surely as God gave you his son, he will give you all the other things you need. As surely as he feeds the sparrows, he's going to feed you. You don't have to worry any longer. God graciously will give you all things. Even if you die, that won't stop God's love. Third question, verse 33, who shall bring any charge against God's elect? This question deals with our guilt. To have a charge brought against us, Paul doesn't mean all those speeding tickets, we get from those cameras here in Ottawa. It's about someone questioning your salvation. Maybe you are rubbing your past in your face. Maybe you feel terrible about something you've done. Paul says there's no guilt because God has declared you righteous in Christ. You can't be charged. There's no court that would listen to the argument. That's what it means to be justified. There's no more guilt. Everything has been settled. So no fear, no worry, no guilt. Question 4 in verse 34. Excuse me one sec. Who is to condemn? Paul already answered this back in verse 1 of chapter 8. Jim dealt with last week, or 2 weeks ago. The answer is no one. No human can condemn you. The only one who could have possibly condemned you is Christ, and he already died. He already died for you. He stands in heaven praying for you. You are not condemned. You're not a prisoner of your bloodline. You're not held down by your past. And then finally, the fifth question in verse 35, who can separate you from the love of Christ? And it is this question which in many ways encompasses the other, and to it Paul gives a double answer. He answers in verse 35 by sort of asking, well, think about the worst disasters. Think about the worst disasters you can imagine, and let's wonder if they can separate us from God's love. What if there was a famine? What if someone came with swords to kill us? What if someone stole everything we had? Maybe one of those disasters would prove that God's love is insufficient. Paul answers in verse 37, no. No, it wouldn't. Christians are more than conquerors because of the love of Christ. And in verse 38, Paul says, well, let's think about all the powers we fear the most. Whether it's death or life or angels or rulers or the present or the future, space and time itself, Paul says, you cannot imagine a thing that will stop God from loving you. If you die, God will still love you. If you are being hounded by spiritual beings and dark forces of this world, God will still love you. God will still love you today. He'll still love you tomorrow. He loves you on this side of the sea. He will love you on the far side of it. God will still love you in the valley of shadow of death. God will still love you if your spouse dies. He'll love you in the midst of your divorce. He'll love you if your kids walk away. He'll love you if you lose your job. He'll love you when you feel unloved. He'll love you as your heart condemns you. God will love you in your suicide attempts, in your depression. He'll love you in your miscarriages and all your failures to conceive. He'll love you in your singleness and in your marriage. He will love you in your loneliness. He will love you in your shattered dreams. Paul says, I am sure of it. I'm sure there isn't a thing in creation. You can't imagine a thing that can stop God's love. And friends, this is the great hope. Not that we muscle ourselves through the futility of life, but because of Christ, we have been freed from worry and fear and guilt and condemnation. And oh, how he loves us. And that is the invitation to the unstoppable love of God. Let's pray together.